Labor is a major concern in the agricultural industries, as well as just utilizing land and water resources as well. And so I think that precision agriculture can bring in some opportunities for ranchers to utilize those scarce resources well.
That was Caleb Hurst, a former ranch manager and current graduate student at Colorado State University's Animal Breeding and Genetics program, about the opportunities precision livestock farming offers. Hi, I'm Jeff Johnston, and welcome to the All Day Digital Podcast, where we talk to industry executives and thought leaders to get their perspective on a wide range of factors shaping the communications industry. This podcast is brought to you by CoBank's Knowledge Exchange Group. Precision livestock farming has yet to take off in the beef cattle industry, despite the fact that it can positively impact ranching operations. Some of the challenges include the upfront costs and lack of awareness regarding the applications and new lower-cost connectivity options that can help enable these applications. Caleb's experience managing ranches and his extensive knowledge of precision livestock farming applications makes him an ideal guest to have on the show. So, without any further ado, pitter-patter, let's hear what Caleb has to say.
Caleb Hurst, welcome to the podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Excellent. So look, I'm really excited to chat with you today about precision livestock farming. It's a pretty fascinating area of agriculture, and you as your time on the ranch, your time as a researcher, I think really positions you well to kind of help us understand some of the more salient points of precision livestock farming. So, maybe you can just kind of give us a high-level overview of what really is precision livestock farming.
Precision livestock farming is the use of technologies and data to make precise decisions, whether that be systematic wide for your operation, or more of on a individual animal level to make decisions with that certain animal on health and other related efficiencies.
Yeah, health makes a lot of sense, right? It would. Having healthy animals and would presumably reduce your input costs and increase your output yield. Is that really the primary focus that ranchers look to when they deploy these applications?
Sure. Optimizing health is one of two. The other one would be allocation of resources. Farmers and ranchers utilize precision agriculture technologies to allocate resources and that are generally scarce better and more. They help producers make more sustainable business decisions as well as raise better, healthier livestock.
So when you say scarce resources, it makes me think of labor, right? Because I saw the most recent report out of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics was that there's 1.6 openings or job openings for every one person looking for a job. So obviously the labor market's extremely tight, right? So are these applications really addressing that particular shortage of resources?
Certainly. Labor is a major concern in the agricultural industries, as well as just utilizing land and water resources as well. And so I think that precision agriculture can bring in some opportunities for ranchers to utilize those scarce resources well.
That makes sense. So maybe we can get into some of the specifics of these applications. If you can kind of help listeners understand, what we could just maybe a couple to whatever top three types of precision livestock applications that are most prevalent out there.
Sure. So it depends on the specific species that you're in. For dairy, they utilize feed intake units, which feed intake units are a bunk system that as the dairy cow approaches the bunk, it reads an ear tag specific to that animal, and they have a scale in that bunk system that tells you exactly how much that animal is eating for that time that it's at the bunk, right, based on weight. And so they're able to calculate some feed efficiencies on that, utilizing less feed, which is a scarce resource again, and producing more milk. They also have milk machines that automatically weigh the milk from the animal and that it produces per milking and puts that into a data system automatically. They also have sensors on those milk machines that can help detect early signs of mastitis, which is a major issue within the dairy industry. In the pork industry, there's some real issues with lameness in sows, and so they actually have sensors on the floors now that can detect movements of those specific sows and know kind of through correlations that if those sows are becoming lame earlier or later. On the poultry side of things, they're utilizing some cloud-based strategies to implement and store data for themselves. They're utilizing those databases to automatically order feed when a feed bin's getting low. I'm most comfortable talking about the beef industry. That's kind of where my experience is. So there's two different sectors in the beef industry. There's a cow-calf sector, which is, as you could guess, is the cow itself that is the producer of baby calves. And so the beginning of the beef process. And then those calves from those cows will eventually enter into a more feedlot system. And so that's the other part of it. And so there's different challenges for both industries, right? So there's land usage and very wide open spaces in one industry, and the other one's a bit more confined, right? So in the cow-calf sector, they're using a lot of drones. They're using virtual fencing. And so on the drone side, they're utilizing drones to check cows that are in pastures that are square miles wide, right? And so they are able to better know where those cattle are, and they're better able to utilize the land that those cattle are on by knowing where those cattle are grazing for that day. And you can also, the drones themselves have heat detection, or a heat detection option on some drones that you can find renegade cattle or lost cattle that aren't necessarily with the herd. And so in terms of a knowing where your animals are located are really helpful within that industry. There's also producers that are using drones in their calving pastures. Calving is a stressful time for both the mother and the baby, and so the least disturbance possible is the best. And so driving a pickup out there or horse or a four-wheeler isn't necessarily like the best option for checking cows while they're having calves, and so you can fly a drone over them and just check to see if everything's going okay, and if you need to then make a decision to go into the field yourselves, you have a more educated answer on if you can go in or not, if it's if she's going to be able to have that calf by herself. And then on the beef side, it's similar to the dairy industry. The feedlot side is similar to the dairy industry in that they're utilizing a lot of feed intake units, as we described, and water intake units as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on.
Yeah. I
mean, those are a lot of really cool applications.
Yeah.
So the one you talked about with the pork, I don't know, mobility, mobility application, whatever. So do they actually have a sensor on the animal, and then they've got sensors under the floor, and then as the animal moves around, if there's anything irregular, that's how they capture it all?
Yeah, porcine creatures have a specific gait, right? And so you're able to tell via an ear tag, just like with the feed intake units in cattle. They also have an ear tag in pork animals as well, that is able to read that specific animal, and then determine whether or not that animal is moving properly.
Wow, just their gait.
Yeah,
actually,
just
so it's not
gait.
Just the amount of walking, it's how they walk.
Right.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. So I mean, these all sound great, and I can see the efficiencies and the benefits to ranchers for deploying these applications. To me, it seems like a kind of like a no-brainer, but you're certainly the expert. I'm not. But what is the adoption rate of these types of applications in ranching?
Published journal studies from several years ago have stated that about 70% of dairies are utilizing some sort of precision technology. And that would probably be less in the cattle industry or in the cow-calf industry for sure. And I think that's in part due to a few factors. One, dairies are more of it in a confined area of space. And then two, at least here in the U.S., dairies are quite a bit larger per operation than your typical cow-calf production unit. So 55% of dairy cows come from a dairy that are 1,000 or more cows per that operation. And in the beef cow-calf area, it's 44. So there's quite a bit more economies of scale for dairy producers rather than cow-calf producers to implement these, sort of decisions and these technologies. That being said, within the beef industry, the feedlots are starting to implicate, put some of these technologies to use, whether it be the feed intake units or the water intake units. And that's due to the fact that they also are large, in comparison to cow-calf. The feedlots themselves are large, but they also are in a confined space at that point, and not just ranging the open range. So
yeah. So something to offer up as I think about the cow-calf industry or segment of the market. I'm not sure how you exactly say it, but it would seem to me that some of the applications that are being deployed or that could be deployed for that part of the market could be limited because of broadband connectivity. I don't know all the applications that are out there, but to the extent that there are applications that cannot be deployed unless you've got some type of a wireless broadband network covering the pasture, there are some really interesting developments over the last few years, thanks to the FCC. I don't have to get into all the specifics, but essentially they sort of democratized owning and operating carrier-grade wireless networks. And when I say carrier-grade, I'm talking about the networks that we use on T-Mobile or Verizon or AT&T. I mean, this is equipment that's built to certain specifications by Tier 1 manufacturers. So these decisions have democratized that. So, for example, a rancher could partner with a local telephone company and pretty cost-effectively deploy wireless broadband connectivity over their pasture. And honestly, 4 or 5 years ago, this simply wasn't possible. You'd have to beg Verizon or beg AT&T to do it. Now they don't need to do that. They can actually do that on their own. So something to be aware of. So people who are listening to this and thinking about limitations on these applications in sort of that cow-calf area, just know that there are options out there, namely this block of spectrums called CBRS. So it's this whole CBRS initiative that will enable these types of applications to be deployed, assuming they need broadband connectivity. So just thought I'd throw that out there. That's my contribution.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the technical requirements on the part of ranchers to be able to deploy and manage these applications. These do sound somewhat sophisticated, but maybe I'm not thinking about it the right way. Maybe just to talk about kind of a lift, if you will. Is this like a heavy lift for a rancher to deploy these types of applications?
Yeah, I think they are getting cheaper, but to put a feed intake unit in a dairy or a feedlot is quite expensive. I think also on the virtual fencing side, on the cow-calf operations, there's some pros and cons, right? So around the virtual fencing, it's based off of a rotational grazing opportunity, right? So cows aren't grazing one specific part of the field at a certain time. You can kind of move them around and utilize the entire land parcel, right? And so priorly, the option was to build a fence and kind of put the parcel into sections, right, and then move those cattle. Well, with virtual fencing, you're able to move those cattle from your phone because they wear a collar, and it's essentially a geofence, right? And so they wear a collar, and when that cow gets close to the geofence, there's a signal, and if it gets any closer, there's a small shock that sends them back into where they're supposed to be. And you are able to move those geofences wherever you want your cattle to graze, right? There is a subscription cost to these companies' products, as well as you have to rent the collar, and so there are some costs to virtual fencing as opposed to the conventional fence line grazing as well. And I think that may be the biggest factor when it comes to slow adoption within the cow-calf sector. I think another thing to consider is data. It's one thing to generate data, it's another to put it to use. In the beef industry, there's more familiarity with technology in the seed stock section of the industry as well as the feedlot section. And seed stock producers are those that are providing genetics to the rest of the industry, bull semen to put it plainly. And they sell genetics down to the rest of the calf sector that eventually sells their calves to the feedlot. Seed stock producers use a lot of technology in their ability to select in mating decisions and precise, accurate data because they're trying to sell bulls. If you're a cow-calf operator, your biggest concern is raising beef. They may have feed intake data from grazing, but they're not as necessarily concerned about utilizing the data, the grazing data. I'm studying cattle genetics in my graduate program and have on-ranch experience. So from my perspective, I'd like to see ranchers utilizing more data and more feed intake units just to have more data to send higher up the chain to those seed stock producers.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. Well, I certainly learned a lot today. You clearly know your stuff, Caleb. So thank you for all of that. But hey, look, before we wrap it up, I always like to give my guests an opportunity to say something or talk about something that I didn't ask, something you think is really important. So, the stage is yours. Any closing thoughts?
There is one cool technology that I've come across in my graduate work, and it revolves around the sustainability or greenhouse gas emissions. So similarly to the feed intake units using a bunk system, there's a machine now that will bait cattle or sheep, whatever species of animal that produces methane, into this machine head stall, right? And they bait them using alfalfa pellets because it's a treat for them. And so it's kind of like a Pavlov's dog situation where a bell will go off and they'll go and they'll have a treat. And so while they're having that treat and eating that treat, that machine is actually collecting data on how much methane production that animal is emitting at that time. And so we're able to then calculate how many grams per day of methane that animal is producing, and we can tweak diets to be able to produce less methane, or we can also do some genetic studies as well to if there's a certain breed type or if there's a certain sire in the industry that doesn't produce as much methane, we could then breed for reduction in methane and greenhouse gas emissions.
That is cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really neat. Yeah. Well, sustainability is a big theme, right? Rightfully so. So it's good to see that there's applications that are, that are supporting that. So that's good stuff. That's good stuff. Caleb, thank you so much for being with us here today. It was an absolute pleasure having you on.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for having me.
A special thanks goes out to Caleb for joining us on the podcast today. From a livestock perspective, I get why dairy farms have adopted new technologies at a faster rate compared to beef ranchers. I mean, the simple fact that dairy cows are in a confined location where their movement is tightly managed versus beef cows who are roaming large pastures speaks for itself. But despite these challenges, I think it's important for ranchers to explore using private wireless networks in their operations, as I think they'd be surprised at how relatively low cost these networks are to build. And as Caleb mentioned, there is big upside for them if they lean into these applications, and I think private wireless networks could play a meaningful role in digitizing their operations. Hey, thanks for joining me today, and watch out for the next episode of the All Day Digital Podcast. CoBank's All Day Digital Podcast is intended for informational purposes only, and the information should not be used without CoBank's express written permission. The information provided in this podcast is not intended to be investment, tax, or legal advice and should not be relied upon by listeners for such purposes. The information contained in this podcast has been compiled from what CoBank regards as reliable sources. However, CoBank does not make any representation or warranty regarding the content and disclaims any responsibility for the information, materials, third-party opinion, and data included in this podcast. In no event will CoBank be liable for any decision made or actions taken by any one person or persons relying on information contained in this podcast.